Today, designing modern board games based on George Philly's forthcoming book, A Class in Board Game Design. Lecture 26, Luck, Technology, and Doctrine. Today is the last lecture of the term. Monday is the last class event, and it is you folks presenting your reports on your game design and how you fixed it, and I will have a brief closing sermon. Today, however, I am going to talk about luck. I am going to talk about that fixation of computer games, technology trees, and why they don't, in the real world, work the pretty way they do on war games. And maybe I'll have a few words summarizing the course at the end. This coming Tuesday is the final exam, and to repeat what I've said, which is also in the syllabus, which is up on my web pages, if you show up, you will be typing your exam on a computer. I figured out how to do that and keep it closed book, no internet access. The only open book you are allowed is your design notebook. If you show up and you do not have a design notebook, which you are turning in at the end of class as one of the things you must do to pass the course, well, this is not quite my issue. Yes?
You'll be taking in the design books, right? Will you be able to give them back to us?
As a practical matter, since this is D term and we are about to hit summer, I will dutifully store them in my office, and you will be able to pick them up next term. Now, if you're a senior and let me know, or if you want it left in the physics office for you, I will leave your design notebook in the physics office. Just leave a post-it on the notebook asking that I leave it in the physics main office. It's the other end of the corridor in Olin from my office, and you can pick it up then. Does this work for everyone? Yes? Other questions?
Is that true for the board games as well?
That is also true for the games. If you want me to leave the game in the physics office for you, I will leave it in the office. You should realize, however, that things left in the physics office have a certain vapor pressure, and you should pick it up reasonably promptly, like within the next, I'll let you know when it's there, and then pick it up within the next couple of days, certainly by graduation. Are people good on this? Okay, so let us actually advance to the lecture. And the first issue is luck, and why we have luck at all. After all, the laws of physics govern all of nature and everything that happens, and the laws of physics are entirely determinate. So why do we say we have luck? And the reason we say we have luck, as a practical matter, is that we also have ignorance. Let me first take a practical example. This would be a war game example. So here you are, and you are attempting to simulate what happens on D-Day, and you're the commander of the American forces, and your troops have gone ashore, and there is a certain point at which you're landing hundreds of thousands of people. You don't have hundreds of thousands of unit counters. You have unit counters that represent companies or battalions or something like that. And what they do is determined by things that you cannot see at the level of the game. So, for example, in practice, in the real landing, there was a landing, and the engineers landed here because the landing aim wasn't that great. And the Bangalore torpedoes, this is a pipe filled with explosives that you push forward to clear barbed wire, landed there. And someone in the middle has to take the initiative either to get them together or to grab the torpedoes and implant them himself, which is not a safe task. And all you can do as the commander of forces, you've trained people, you've motivated them, and you have to assume that someplace there is someone who is going to win their Medal of Honor or their Victoria Cross, and with some luck come home alive and in one piece. That often did not occur. But you can't control that. It's a matter of chance who rises to the occasion. History shows that in circumstances like this, people do rise to the occasion. As one of my drill sergeants noted when I was in the Army, he could point at neighboring unit. We are in a bunker. a hand grenade rolls into the bunker, and one of the people, since the grenade was not in a location where you could throw it back easily, threw himself on the grenade and saved everyone else's life. That's a Medal of Honor. But who does that? You can't predict that. That's not knowable in advance. That's why you have luck, because there are things that the player cannot foresee, cannot foretell, does not have the information to handle, and you have to say, well, maybe it'll happen, and maybe it won't. And at the level of the last example I gave, well, you don't know if you'll do it yourself until the issue comes up, now do you? So that is luck. It's a representation of factors you do not know and cannot control, and they will break different ways on different times. Having said that, talked about luck, we will now advance to technology. And technology and tech trees are sort of the fixation of many computer games of particular style, and also some board games like Civilization. That's the old Civilization that Sid Meier turned into Sid Meier's Civilization, that was turned into a board game, Sid Meier's Civilization, which is not the same as the original game quite. They're tech trees. They're things that happen because there's human progress. And it sounds very convincing that that should be going on in at least some sorts of events. However, there is a wonderful short story by Arthur C. Clarke, Supremacy. The short story, if you're familiar with history, is somewhat modeled after what happened to the Germans in World War II. But what happens in the short story, we are having a prisoner of war being interrogated, and he explains why his side lost. Namely, they disposed of this neat weapon and that neat weapon and the other neat weapon, and none of them quite worked or could be put out in time. And by the time they had something that might have worked, they lost the war. And his closing remark is that he understands that he is probably going to be put to death or locked up in prison, and the only thing he asks is that he not be locked up with the Minister of Technology because of his side, because he refuses to be responsible for what is going to happen. The historical Germans had a slightly different problem. If you read histories, they had all of these neat gadgets, but they were unable to deploy them effectively. So for most of the war, they depended on the same fighter plane with modest improvements they had at the start of the war. It was not that good a plane. They depended on the same submarine they had at the start of the war, and it became sufficiently obsolete. It tended to get sunk before it reached the deep waters of the Atlantic. But there is technology, and it can have a positive result. Sometimes technology matters and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes there are hidden factors that matter. Let us take an example. This is an aircraft carrier. Another aircraft carrier. You may correctly assume that most of my technology examples are going to correspond to most of the computer games you're ever going to be dealing with, namely they involve military things. And this side has an aircraft with a combat radius of 350 miles. And this side has aircraft with a combat radius of 250 miles. And therefore, it might seem that this side just stays out here, out of range of the other side, and is guaranteed to sink the other side. Those of you who have read the science fiction author David Weber, the Honor Harrington series, Weber is very heavy on female strong protagonists. For some people, this can be very educational. In any event, we'll notice this is the advantage that the good guys have with some advantage. But here we're talking about aircraft carriers in World War II. And this is the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1944. This is the U.S. Navy in 1944. And what actually happened was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which, well, the Japanese had very nice long-range aircraft. They had some design problems, And they did not have the underlying doctrine to train their pilots well. They had wonderful pilots at the start of the war, but the new pilots were very poorly trained. The net result was the Japanese lost, 400 aircraft, while the United States lost 40. They also lost some, but not all, of their aircraft carriers, and that got very controversial. And the net result was, yeah, technology matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. There are other things that matter. Training, doctrine. Let's take another aircraft carrier example. And it starts with a riddle that I don't think I have posed to this class before. Would anyone care to remember in which war the United States deployed its first aircraft carrier? It was the American Civil War. The aircraft carrier, I said aircraft, not airplane, was the George Washington Parke Custis. It fielded a hydrogen balloon for observation. It did really high-tech stuff, including first time anyone had ever sent a telegraph message down from a balloon. And we actually fielded these. The Confederates were horrified because they could see this Union balloon sitting there out of rifle range, watching their every move, and they viewed it as militarily disastrous. The Union generals were reasonably happy with them. The Union military bureaucrats, well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad, thought this was a pain in the neck. And there was no good doctrine on how you employed these. More important, there was no table of organization and equipment. The Union general could not say, I am entitled to a hydrogen observation balloon. I am entitled to so many master aeronauts, so many signalers, so many balloons. Where are they? It says in regulations I get to have them. There are a series of battles like Gettysburg where this could have made an enormous difference if they had been deployed. But we didn't have the doctrine, we didn't have the regulations, and so the hydrogen balloon was something that might have worked. The technology was perfectly adequate. In fact, the lead Union aeronaut, who had given himself the title professor, was involved in a major research project to see if you could fly a free balloon across the Atlantic using 1860 technology. It would be a floating in the wind balloon, not a powered balloon. That was really iffy, to put it very charitably. He never tried. Nonetheless, we have technology, but because the doctrine isn't there, it doesn't get deployed. Another example, if you go back to, the 14th century, you almost did not have firearms. There were very primitive cannon. You did have lots of people with good bowmen. The English, of course, will talk up the English longbow. The crossbow gets undersold rather badly relative to its actual utility. The Mongols, of course, thought they had better bows than anyone else. They were, however, cemented composites, and period cement did not do well in humid weather. It did great in the steppes of Central Asia. If they had attempted to invade Western Europe, they might have had interesting problems with their wonderful bows falling apart in the rain. Nonetheless, the question is, why did the gun replace the bow? And if you read Oman, who was a British historian of the 19th century, a fine British historian whose objective in life was to prove that the purpose of all military history, indeed all civilization, was to lead you to Victorian England, the center of all perfection. Oman claimed that the reason the English bowman was superior was that they practiced once a week for years and years, but it took decades of training to make a good archer. Let's think about this for a minute. If I go running once a week, this works for all of you, will I even maintain muscle tone? If this is a vigorous physical activity. It has to be repeated a lot. It requires a lot of precision. It's like playing basketball. How many NBA basketball players do you note in their 40s and 50s? Not a whole lot. And the answer is, if you actually go back to period sources, which Oman apparently did not, the period sources claim that one of the important advantages of the bow over the gun was that it was much easier to train archers, it took a couple of seasons, than it was to train a gunner. After all, if you were loading a matchlock, you have an object and you're trying to stuff gunpowder and other stuff down it. And by the way, the gun has what is called a slow match, which is on fire. And so you are trying to handle gunpowder, and you have this burning thing standing right here, or you hold it in one hand while you're pouring the powder with the other hand. This is very difficult to do. It's especially difficult to do under battlefield conditions. It took years to train a good gunner. The gun also had, maybe a tenth the rate of fire of the bow. So why did the gun win? And the answer appears to be that with good steel armor, not light iron armor as the French had at Crécy and Agincourt, but with good steel armor, the longbow was only effective at really point-blank range. The gun had a much larger range, ignoring the fact that it only hit things by dumb luck, at which it could actually go through armor. On the other hand, if you march forward to 1800, Ben Franklin figured this out, believe it or not. Soldiers did not wear armor. Well, maybe there were a few cuirassiers, but almost no one wore armor, and therefore the bow, 10 times the rate of fire, close to 10 times the range at which you might have a chance of hitting things if the wind was steady, and all these other neat features, the bow should have triumphed. Indeed, the English military historian Chandler, who points at these things, and the historian Nosworthy, I'm giving you two more names, Chandler, you don't have to look them up for the exam. Nosworthy did very serious studies of how weapons actually worked and how effective they were, and the conclusion was as late as 1800 or 1820, firearms were mostly a morale weapon. Yeah, that you occasionally kill people. In the words of Frederick the Great, we advanced to within 20 or 30 yards of the Austrian lines. My men and theirs shoot at each other, and after 10 or 15 minutes of shooting at 3 or 5 rounds a minute, the Austrian lines will become indistinct. And at that point, we can effectively charge with the bayonet. If you tried this with modern forces, like the M16A1 I trained on in the Army at 30 yards, and started shooting each other across the room, after not 15 minutes, but 15 seconds, assuming people were properly trained, almost everyone would be dead. Notice I said trained. There are famous examples, I won't name the country, in which we have allegedly well-trained militia, police units, and drug dealers at opposite ends of a 18-wheeler truck, inside the truck, shooting at each other, and after both sides have fired some hundreds of rounds, the bad guys ran out of ammunition and surrendered. No ambulances were needed. No one had been injured. So, yeah, technology isn't everything you need. There are also, of course, technologies which are epic fails. Let's go back to the 19th century. If you go back to the 19th century and look at battleships, they had rams on them. Ram bows designed so you could ram an enemy ship and back off, and the enemy ship, which was now sinking, would slide off your ram rather than dragging you to the bottom. Hey, it's just as great as what the ancient Athenians did in 500 BC. The reason people did this was the Battle of Lissa, in which there were actually several successful uses or accidental rammings that sank things. No battleship ever successfully rammed an enemy vessel. You can point out in World War II destroyer escorts ramming German submarines. They weren't equipped with ram bows. The same battleships, or slightly later, were also equipped with torpedo tubes firing sideways. There is one historical example of these actually being used in combat, perhaps even effectively. That was the British battleships engaging the German battleship Bismarck in World War II. At the same period, some of you may remember Admiral Dewey. That was on one coast, or the Battle of Santiago. This is Spanish-American War. And we had a warship that was equipped with a dynamite gun. And it fired large loads of dynamite at enemy ships. It used a big compressed air system because if you tried to fire dynamite out of a regular cannon, the flame would detonate the dynamite probably inside the barrel. This is bad. The dynamite gun never hit anything. The defense of that, though, is if you go back to pre-dreadnought warships, they mounted very large guns. They had a very large effective range. H.G. Wells in War of the Worlds had to dodge around the issue that the Martian heat ray was a line of fire weapon, and British Navy battleships could have engaged Martian war machines without coming into their range. The limit on this was that they hadn't worked out how to aim the things, and what were in fact computers, real Babbage computers with gears, were evolved as World War I approached. And they really worked. They worked well enough so that in the one battle fought in the southern hemisphere, in the Falkland Islands in World War I, the correction for Coriolis forces, the Earth is rotating, had the wrong sign because you were in the other hemisphere. And after the British kept missing until some bright junior officer pointed out you had to flip the sign on one correction. And then everything worked. It did. They sank the German fleet. Oh, there are other neat gadgets. There are the notion of huge tanks. The Germans built tanks that were going to push up to 100 tons, like the Mouse. That didn't work too well. The U.S. had the T-29, which was so heavy that it would have gone through any bridge in Europe pretty much. The Russians, before World War II, had the TG-5. It was so big it had 5 turrets. It was so complicated it would never fly or do anything. Oh, coming back to battleships, I almost forgot. The Japanese, for the battleship, super battleship Musashi, the most powerful battleship ever built, the Japanese believed in load it down with everything and had at least one cruiser that more or less capsized as a result, was equipped with depth charge racks, meaning the stern of the ship was covered with high explosives. This is not a good idea. There are also things, I said technology didn't work. Langley, most of you have not heard of Langley. In 1895-98, he convinced the Navy that he would build for them powered airplane to do range sighting so that battleships could hit targets at large distance. He built a 1/8 scale model which flew beautifully. It really did. It was a powered aircraft. Well, powered unmanned aircraft. It was the world's first military drone. After all, the Navy did pay for it. He then tried to build a full-scale aircraft 8 times as big, 8 times as long, 16 times the wing area, so only 64 times more lift, 500 times the weight. The propeller, instead of being, there's a reason you make propellers out of steel or aluminum, there's a lot of load on them, was balsa wood covered with canvas. As the press coverage of the launch said, it flew like a load of mortar. It failed. He tried to scale up too much. That's technology that fails. On the other hand, there's technology that has fixes. Some of you have heard of hovercraft, yes? Military hovercraft, Virtue, can go in essentially zero depth of water because they are above the water level. The first military hovercraft, though, was the Versuchsgleitboot, launched by the Austro-Hungarian Navy in 1915. It was a brilliant invention. It had one minor problem. Basically, a hovercraft works because you push air under it and it floats on the column of air, but the air blows out to the sides. If you look at a modern hovercraft, it has what are called skirts, which are heavy canvas or steel or whatever, things that are floppy and go down and discourage the air from escaping. Austro-Hungarians had not invented this, and therefore the payload and range of this thing was not quite up to what they needed for military purposes. If they had made that invention, everything would have worked. Just the same way, if we go back to 1913, they considered adopting the world's first tank, well, maybe armored car. However, it's 1913. No one is concerned that internal combustion engines are a bit noisy, and so they didn't have mufflers on the engine. It panicked any cavalry it approached, and they decided that the cavalry was more useful than a few of these gadgets were, so they did not develop. Other neat innovations that worked well. If you go back to the Revolutionary War, George Washington had riflemen. You will occasionally find people who do not understand military technology who say, well, he should have just equipped all of his army with rifles and had them hide in the trees and snipe at the British. There are two problems with this. The first problem is this is a black powder weapon. When you fire it, it emits this enormous gout of black charcoal, which is in fact sufficiently black that after a few rounds are fired by a line of men, you can't see the enemy through the cloud of charcoal. You cannot hide and fire a black powder weapon several times. The other problem was the only way you could load this was to put the ball into the rifle and quite literally hammer it down all the way so you could get off a round every 2 or 3 minutes. Well, maybe a minute and a half if you were good until the weapon fouled because the powder didn't all leave the weapon. And while you were reloading, the British soldiers you shot at, who are really annoyed that you killed one of their number, will be running at you, preparing to do educational things like sticking bayonets through you and sticking you to the nearest tree. And as a result, rifles, except as support for real infantry, didn't work. The solution was the mini-ball. The mini-ball was cone, little metal plates. This is very small. This is a ½ an inch across. You dropped it into the rifle. The gunpowder is here. When the gunpowder fires, it drives the plates sideways into the rifling. It just drops in. It blows out, and the rifling now works. And with these, you could get 5 rounds a minute off. Well, they didn't have mini balls during the American Revolution, but they did for the Civil War. And for the Civil War, people rapidly noticed that Napoleonic, let's line up shoulder to shoulder and shoot at the enemy tactics were an interesting way to die. And shovels and field fortifications were a great idea. Other technology that was fixed. There was an Italian military theorist, Duquette. He was between the two wars. His doctrine was that the bomber will always get through. So if you send flights of bombers at enemy cities, they will more or less all get through all the time. And you shower enemy cities with incendiaries, poison gas. We didn't use that in no one used that in World War II. Well, except the Italians against the Ethiopians and the Japanese against the Chinese. The Japanese also used germ warfare. The Japanese, I mean. In any event, Duquette said because there was no way for a fighter aircraft to intercept the bomber. He based this on the assumption that fighter aircraft did not carry radios, and therefore there was no way to tell them where the enemy bombers were. we were told enemy bombers were seen here, and so you flew up a flight of fighters, and you went looking for the enemy bombers, who hopefully were not doing impolite things like flying inside clouds. Radio solved that. Ah, yes. Technology that worked, but not the way you thought. The atomic bomb. End of World War II. We dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese, and the short form is they did surrender. And the slightly longer form is that it gave the Emperor Hirohito an excuse to insist that the Japanese surrender. Russians will correctly note that the Japanese surrendered after Russia declared war on Japan and started marching south, and basically rolled through Manchuria without facing significant resistance. And as I have very recently discovered, there was another minor feature. The Japanese had captured a fighter pilot who was shot down, and they did something which does not work at all. But sometimes when you're desperate, you do stupid things. They tortured him for all of the information he had about atomic bombs. And after a while, he figured out what they wanted. And he told them exactly what they wanted. He told them a version of what they wanted, which is that we had another 50 of them on hand in Okinawa, and in the next few weeks we would be dropping all of them on the Japanese. And while 1 or 2 was sufficient, was fairly impressive, the thought of having another 50 of them show up apparently didn't motivate people to continue wanting to resist, and they changed sides. Another technology that got fixed, the hydrogen bomb. And this is one of these. You will read several accounts of this historically. They're not quite as good as you would want. The original American hydrogen bomb, unlike the original Russian hydrogen bomb, is often described as not being a useful weapon because it weighed 52 tons. And the line was, well, you could only deliver it by ox cart. And that's a slight exaggeration. An ox cart won't pull 52 tons. However, in point of fact, the B-39G could handle a 39-ton bomb load. And between telling Boeing we need to increase the bomb load piece and telling the designers this time we need something that is as light as possible, not as stuffed with instruments to see whether it blows up properly or not as possible, we need to bring the 2 weights together, and assuredly that would have happened. The serious problem, which is why the Russians had a real weapon and we didn't, was that our weapon used liquid hydrogen. And liquid hydrogen boils at like minus 450 Fahrenheit. You have to keep it incredibly cold. And if it leaks, you have clouds of hydrogen floating around the airplane, which is also full of propeller engines and such not. And you have a great risk that the bomber will attempt to imitate the Hindenburg. So Teller realized this, and Teller, who wandered around Los Alamos asking for people on ways to store hydrogen. And he encountered Ulam, who noted metal hydrides, in particular lithium hydride. It's a solid. It's fairly stable. Well, it will burn, but it's fairly stable. And when Teller heard this, he suddenly made a connection. This was a connection that actually had been published in Astounding Science Fiction a decade before. Namely, instead of using the atomic bomb to trigger fusion of hydrogen, you use it to trigger more complicated nuclear reactions involving lithium hydride, and suddenly you have a hydrogen bomb. And a bit later, people pointed out, you have all of these bomb parts that hold things together, and if you build them of uranium, because you have all this depleted uranium lying around, instead of steel, when the hydrogen does its fusion thing, there will be waves of neutrons going through it, and you will get massive amounts of fission, which, by the way, is where you get most of the explosive power. So there was a technical fix, but it was a series of lucky accidents. So that is the sort of thing that happens when you try to do technology. Maybe it will work, Maybe it will be a complete crock like the radar array, which was supposed to be usable for shooting down enemy bombers by setting them on fire. It was a giant microwave oven without the oven. Didn't work. And sometimes it does work. There are also cases where doctrine does not work as well as you would like. And sometimes you have doctrine and you reinvent old errors. I will take a couple of examples. World War I, the Germans had Zeppelins. Zeppelins had incredible range. The Germans could easily have bombed New York City, or for that matter, Worcester, Massachusetts, using Zeppelins. They could not have done it a lot, but they could have done it. They instead tried to bomb London, which was the most heavily defended anti-aircraft, fighter aircraft city in the world, and kept losing Zeppelins. The good use of Zeppelins, though, would have been you send out the Zeppelin over the Atlantic. It has an enormous cruising range, plus you can just turn off the engines and it won't fall, and it won't be using any fuel either. And you use the Zeppelins to look for Allied shipping, which you simply radio the locations of. Zeppelin is way up there and cannot be shot down by surface warships. And the German submarines now know where to go to find Allied ships. If the Germans had done this, they might have been able to win the war, but the German master of airships had an ego trip involvement in bombing London, so they fortunately didn't. Of course, well, this sounds silly, doesn't it? Let's advance to World War II. American submarines had the same problem, finding Japanese merchant ships to sink them. So the Navy, the submarine force, kept asking the Army Air Corps to give them some number of B-29s equipped with radar to find the Japanese ships. That was a very hard effort because we were very involved in bombing Japan as opposed to sinking their ships so they would run out of fuel and all sorts of other stuff. You can recycle these errors. Another example, slightly more contemporary. If you look at the end of World War II, we got really enthusiastic with building big surface warships. And we kept building them after we'd sent the Japanese Navy to the bottom. So they really didn't have a lot to engage. We didn't need anti-aircraft cruisers, but a lot of the other stuff was less useful. And this was sort of noticed, but if you consult Drop Shot or Half Moon, those are our World War III plans from, 1950 or so. These are the declassified ones. You discover we make a huge investment in building big surface warships again, even though we would have been fighting the Soviet Union, a country that had essentially no surface navy. So you can recycle bad decisions, and you don't always learn from your decisions. Let me take a more fortunate example of failure to learn. World War I, the Germans tried submarine warfare to force Britain to surrender and instead brought the U.S. into the war. World War II, Battle of the Atlantic, the German Navy tried to strangle the British again, not successfully. You might think, if you're sending troops to invade Japan, they have to sail across the whole Pacific. In fact, my father got as far as Bora Bora this way, and then the Solomons this way. The Japanese Navy had superb submarines, long enough range that they could sail from Japan to the U.S. and bombard the coast. They did this a few times. One of them had enough range to sail around the world without refueling using diesel power. That's actually quite good. They had the best torpedoes in the world, but their doctrine was submarines were scouts for the Kessin, the big battle in which we will sink the American Navy, and they shouldn't be wasting their time shooting at merchant ships. So the Japanese made essentially no effort to sink our merchant fleet in the Pacific, which was an enormous advantage for us, even though they were getting good advice from the Germans. Remember, those submarines can sail around the world? The Japanese repeatedly sailed submarines from Japan, Singapore, to Germany and back during the war, and brought back things like jet engine plans and all sorts of other neat stuff, but they didn't listen to the Germans. So that is the sort of place in which you can have doctrinal errors that do not work. Okay, so we've sort of talked about technology and tech trees, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it does not work. And sometimes doctrine matters as much as weapons. If you are clever and have good doctrine, the fact that your weapons are out of date isn't necessarily as critical. Remember medieval times? Some of you have played D&D. Combat axes? The Austro-Hungarian army revived the combat axe in World War I because they discovered it was much more effective than the rifle with bayonet at close quarters. And it worked. That's doctrine. That's studying what will work as opposed to pursuing whatever ego trip you have someplace. Well, having said all this, I have now discussed technology, and I will now give a brief summary, a very brief summary of the course. I mean, by the end of the course, we will have had 42 hours of class, which is as much as you would have had at a conventional class at a school with 14 rather than 7-week terms. We've had 7 lab sessions where I hope you've learned something about playtesting and game development. We have had a couple of presentations so you could say what you did or didn't do. And in between, we have had all of these lectures on interesting issues about games. What are some of those issues? Well, let's go back to the elements that form games. And there are representations, what you see on the table or whatever it is. After all, for a LARP, you don't have a table, so you have representations. You have style and mechanism. And style and mechanism are very different, but a list of styles and a list of mechanisms almost completely, not quite, overlap. What else do we have? Theme. Theme is what you are probably going to be fed if you ask someone, what is the game about? And you will get back, it's about pirates and zombies and vampires all at the same time. Well, it could be. Then you have shape. And shape is what the game occupies in the player's life. And it may be very simple, like scissors, paper, rocks, or it may be a little more substantial, like Victory in the Pacific with 9,000 unit counters. Just think, if you penny mounted all of them, you'd need $90 of pennies. Shape. Then there's voice. And voice we went over, first person, second person, third person, singular, plural, and that is mostly, went over that in large part as a defense, so that you all learn how to defend yourself against stupid reviewers. Now this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I must have forgotten something, mustn't I? How about components? The parts that fall out of the box. Yes, you will each have a box for your game. If you have a big map, it should be sectioned and mounted so it fits in the box. How about content? Of course, content varies. We have this at least very amusing game about exploring pyramids, in which we perhaps, I believe the original design had dynamite, which is Indiana Jones' grandfather's idea of archaeology. We had erupting volcanoes, which are really realistic. You know, there are reasons why most people do not build cities near volcanoes, notwithstanding the notorious example of Martinique. The funny island near Indonesia with Krakatoa. Content is, if you're going to design a game or produce a movie, the movie was originally, I forget, I'm going to get the order wrong, Krakatoa, west of Java. Then someone pointed out that if you looked on a map, the movie should have been titled Krakatoa, east of Java. It was fixed. It's not a critical issue, but that's content, and content can matter. And with that, I give you the closing thought, which will also be my sermon on Monday. There is an enormous amount of development that has been done on games, board games, much more than has been done for first-person shooters. And if you are sensible, you learn and enrich, just as if you're doing painting. You study all sorts of painting styles and all sorts of other things, fabric, glass blowing, etc. Those of you who are on art track, I hope are listening to me or already figured this out in some cases rather obviously. Your other choice, though, say it's a first-person. All computer games are first-person shooters, for which Greg Kostikian's advice is, don't be a vidiot. And with that, our last lecture is complete. Class is dismissed.